of the Windermere children's story actually begins about 3 months after World War II is over. So it begins when 300 child survivors of the Nazi concentration camps, thank you, arrived mainly from Prague. They came from Prague and they went to the north of England to Windermere. It's in the Lake District. It's a beautiful, beautiful area. They came to recover and they came to rebuild their lives. So before we get into my dad's connection to the Windermere children, I want to give you a very brief summary of his life. At another time I can go into detail about any of this stuff, but I just want to catch you up so you know what he'd been through before he became one of the Windermere children. So let's see, how do I... Okay, so my dad was born before the war in Warsaw, Poland. Here he is. He was the youngest of 4 children. He was born into a very loving family, and I think he's adorable. He stayed adorable. But life was reasonably good, but later it became bad. When the war started, my dad was 12, and pretty soon after the war started, the Nazis walled in the area where a lot of the Jews lived, and it became the Warsaw Ghetto. And the Warsaw Ghetto became more and more impenetrable, so pretty soon there was hardly any food in the ghetto. It just couldn't get in and out. People couldn't get in and out, and they were literally starving to death and dying on the streets. So the conditions were really bad. So when my dad was 13, my grandparents realized he wasn't going to survive if he didn't get out of the Warsaw Ghetto. So they devised a scheme for my dad to smuggle himself out of the ghetto. And it was a very risky and dangerous plan, but it actually involved a trolley car that probably looked like that one. I'll tell you a deeper story another time. But if he was caught escaping, he would have been shot on the spot. So you can imagine a 13-year-old escaping in danger of his life. But he did it. He managed to escape and get out of the Warsaw Ghetto. So that was a huge relief. Unfortunately, he never saw his parents again. But they did manage to save his life by getting him out or devising this plan to get him out of the ghetto. So when he left the Warsaw Ghetto, he went to a town in the south of Poland called Ostrowiec. He had several relatives there. So for a while, for a few weeks I should say, things were better in Ostrowiec than in the Warsaw Ghetto. At least there was some food. But pretty soon things got pretty bad there too. And there was this Nazi war factory, iron works factory. They made like train wheels and iron tracks and things like that. And so my dad worked there for about 2.5 years, from age 14 to 16. He was working in this factory. He was a slave laborer. So he worked really, really, really hard. Physically really hard because iron's really heavy. And also he could work a shift and then they'd get him to work another shift and another shift. So he worked very hard, but it literally saved his life. For example, at some point the Nazis rounded all the Jews up from this town and sent them all off to be murdered, except the Jews that worked for this factory and another factory that was in town. They were the only ones that were saved because this was an essential factory for the war effort. So he worked there for about 2.5 years, and then he and all the other workers were taken to Auschwitz. Now, I presume you guys know about the horrors of the concentration camps, so I won't say much. He went through the worst of the worst. Forced labor, hardly any food. They would stand outside in the horrible, very frigid Polish winters, and my dad called them pajama-type clothes, no hats, no coats, no boots, no nothing. And the sleeping arrangements, no pillows, no mattress, no blankets, didn't even have your own space. Yeah, they were horrible. So after a few months, my dad was on the death march that was described in Elie Wiesel's Night, if you've read that book. He described it. My dad said that's what he went through. Oops, I'm going the wrong way here. Oh, no, I'm going. How do I go backwards?
The up arrow and the down arrow should go.
What do I do?
Up arrow and down arrow should go.
Down, okay, I'm sorry. I'm going going to, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. Okay. No, I have gone.
Or you can take it out of presentation mode.
What?
Maybe take it out of presentation mode for a second.
Oh, wait, am I going backwards or forward?
Yeah, you're going back.
Sorry, I'm going too far here.
There you go.
Okay, so here we go. Okay. So, where was I? Yeah, so he was on a death march and he ended up in Buchenwald, which is in Germany. And he said the conditions there were even worse than in Auschwitz. It was almost the end of the war and the Nazi war effort was like falling apart. So there was even less food and they didn't even have real work for the people to do. So they gave them make work, like carry these heavy boulders up a hill and then carry them back down. They just were evil. So my dad was there for about 2 months, and then he was on another death march, and part of the death march was they went on these trains. This is part of the actual train that my dad arrived on at his destination, which was Theresienstadt. But they were on this train for about 3.5 weeks with absolutely no food, no water, and no hygienic facilities. Only about 10% survived. So my dad was so sick and so malnourished when he got to Theresienstadt. He said if the war had gone on any longer, he wouldn't have made it. He was just almost dead. But they arrived just about the time that the war ended. I believe they arrived, I'm not sure, on May 8th, so that was the end of the war in Europe. And so the Jews were liberated by the Russians, and the Nazis ran away. And my dad said he was too weak from hunger and from sickness to get up and watch them run away. That was one of his regrets, that he couldn't see the Nazis run away. But he was liberated in Theresienstadt, and he immediately was put in the hospital because he was very, very sick. And the Russian doctors and nurses kind of got him quite a bit better. And when he got better, a few weeks later, he met up with a group of Jewish children who were going to go to England. So England said that they would allow in 1,000 young survivors. They were supposed to be 15 and younger and healthy. They only found 732, but even with that, a lot of the children were a little bit older. Like my dad was 17 and sick, and a lot of the children were older than 15 and sick. But luckily there was a Jewish doctor in charge of the camp medical facilities at Theresienstadt, and he stamped that they were 15 and healthy. So my dad and some of the other children got to go to England. So this group eventually became known as the Boys. There were 732 of them, but the first 300 went to Windermere. So, excuse me, my dad was one of the first 300, and that's the movie you're going to see about, the 300 children. So actually these 300 children went from Theresienstadt, which is near Prague. They went to the old city in Prague and took group photos, and then they went to the airport to fly to England. So this is 1945. My dad's that little face in the red circle. And then in 2019, 250 of us went to recreate that photo. So I went with 2 of my sons and my daughter-in-law, and we tried to stand about where my dad was, approximately as close as we could get. So that was a very meaningful trip. So they flew from Prague to Windermere. Excuse me. My dad didn't talk much about the Holocaust when we were growing up, but one story he told us a lot about was this flight from Prague to Windermere. He said they didn't fly on a standard, airliner like we would now with seats and seat belts and food service and everything. These planes were former bombers. Just 3 months earlier, they'd been shooting bombs down at the enemy. So they just sat on the floor. This is an actual picture of several of the boys. And then my dad, with a twinkle in his eye, would say, "The pilot brought us a chocolate bar." And can you imagine these children who 3 months before were basically almost starving to death? The chocolate bar was not just food to eat, to eat like nutrition, but it was something a cut above, like it was a luxury of chocolate bar. And So another thing that I always thought when I heard the story was, like, it's such an amazing story, but thought, I wish I could thank the pilot, but who was he? I mean, you know, when you fly, you don't know who the pilot is. But guess what? They found the pilot. And here he is in the cap in 2019, the same time we went to Prague. They found him, and he came to the reunion. This group, they meet in London every year. And so he came to the reunion, and he brought chocolate bars ahead of him around. But my family and I, we wrote a letter to him, and his granddaughter said she read it to him. And we thanked him for not just flying my dad and the children to England, but also for just the thought to elevate, like, the food that he gave them, the chocolate bar, you know. And my dad told that story until he couldn't tell stories anymore, but he, you know, he remembered that. And the reason I'm telling you this story is you'll see the chocolate bar in the movie, and they don't explain what's the story with the chocolate bar, but now you know what it is about. So they flew to a place right near Windermere, and excuse me, in 2022 we were invited to go to Windermere and sort of retrace the steps of our parents. So I went. Here I am, and you can see how beautiful it is. There are lakes and mountains, and just a very pretty area in the Lake District of England. And so the bottom picture is actually a group of us on the grounds of where the children went when they went to Windermere. The buildings where they lived have been torn down, but excuse me. Need a drink of that. So the British Central Committee, which I'm going to refer to as a committee from now on, they organized a lot of support for this group, the Windermere children. They brought in a psychologist, and they brought in an art therapist, and a soccer coach, and a rabbi, and a few other people to help them, like, readjust to life. And so soccer was a really big thing. It was kind of a normal way for young teenagers to get a lot of energy out and do something that a normal British teenager would do, play soccer, and they learned to, you know, be sportsmen and whatever. So this is actually the field where they played soccer. And what happened with my dad was one day he was playing soccer, and he fell down, and he was too weak to get up. He's very sick. His sickness that he'd had in Prague had gone away a little bit, came back. It never totally went away, actually. So they discovered that he had tuberculosis. And now I think if you have tuberculosis, you take antibiotics. So back then, the treatment was bed rest and a lot of fresh air. So he was sent to this.
It's called a sanitarium.
Yes, exactly. So this is the sanitarium that he was sent to. It's near Windermere. And the air is the most fresh you can imagine. It's a sea air, and also it's right in the middle of nowhere, so it's like farm air. It's very fresh. So this is now condos, but this is actually the hospital that he was in, a sanatorium where he was to recuperate. So they would have taken the patients out on beds into this beautiful yard during the day for a lot of fresh air, and then brought them into the buildings at night, or if it was raining or whatever. So I got to see where my dad was. Now I mentioned that they had to stay in the bed, and that they brought in teachers. You can imagine most of these children, and I know for sure my dad, hadn't had any education for years. So my dad, I think around when he was 12, it was before the war, no longer had any education. And now he's about 18, and he's sick. And these kids are all in beds, you can see. But they brought in teachers to start teaching them. They had to learn English, and they had to generally catch up. Whatever you learned in middle school and high school, they had to learn. So I tried zooming in on that chalkboard, and I think it's a literature lesson. It looks like English or something. And that teacher is actually, her name is Marie Pineth. You'll see in the movie an art therapist who works with the kids, and that's the real art therapist. Her work with this group was foundational work for the profession of art therapy. So I know an art therapist that she said that they actually studied her work with this traumatized group of Holocaust survivors. So anyway, that's how my dad started his education, and he actually did very serious studying. Not all the children did, but my dad studied a lot. So more about that a little later. This is a group of the children who had tuberculosis a little bit later when they didn't have to be in bed all day. My dad has the arrow on his head. You can see the doctor and nurse that took care of them. So when we were in Windermere, we went on a boat ride on the lake one day, and 6 of us discovered that all of our parents had been one of the children that had tuberculosis. Thank God they recovered enough to get married and have children, and here we were 74 years later. But that was a pretty cool thing to share that common history. So the committee actually tried to make each child enjoy life. They had a total of 732 in all, and so my dad's situation, they found out he liked to play violin when he was a kid, and he was actually pretty good apparently. So they bought him a violin, and here he is playing it with one of his teachers accompanying him on the piano. My sister and I, when we struggled through our violin lessons as kids, realized my dad was a pretty good violin player. They also took the children to movie theaters. That's what a normal teenager would do. And we got to go to the movie theater and sit in the seats that our parents would have sat in. This is my dad about a year after he arrived in England. He looks pretty good. Probably much better than he would have looked when he arrived in England because he was so sick. However, he still had tuberculosis, and he really wasn't healthy enough to really function totally well for about 7 years. So you'll see in the movie they talk about the Windermere thing going on for 4 months, and they were only in Windermere for 4 months, but then they were put in different places all around England and Ireland and Scotland and even in France, I think. So for my dad's case, he was supported for 7 years. The committee supported each child until they could get on their feet. For most of the children, it wasn't that long, but my dad, because he was so sick, it was 7 years.
Excuse me, that means he didn't leave Windermere for 7
No,
years?
he did leave Windermere. They all had to leave Windermere after 4 months, but then they put them in different places. My dad took the sanatorium route because I'll show you another sanatorium he was in a minute. But some of them were in hostels in Manchester, London, in Scotland, Paris, I don't know, Bournemouth, Southampton, different places. They had a philosophy that they wanted them to be in groups of like 20 or 30 people, because first of all, a lot of them were teenagers, and they needed to like bond with each other. They went through things that we can never understand, but they commiserated with each other, and they bonded. In fact, most of them arrived feeling like orphans. Most of them were orphans. They didn't have family. So they were like brothers and sisters to each other. And we second generations say we were like cousins. My dad was actually very fortunate because he did find that his brother and his sister survived. So did I answer your questions? Yeah. So a lot of them went to different hostels. There was actually a group of young children, and they had to be brought up. The youngest was 2. So they had some young children, and they put them in a special hostel where they had to bring them up. I mean, like my dad was old enough that he needed help, but he was almost a grown-up. But the young ones needed to be brought up for several years. So it depended on the situation. A lot of them were taught trades. Some became jewelers or tailors or electricians or whatever. Some became judges, doctors. There was one guy you'll see in the movie. He was very athletic, and he became an Olympic weightlifter. He went to the Olympics for England twice as an Olympic weightlifter, and he taught a lot of the children how to lift weights, including my dad. So they did a lot of pretty impressive things. One guy became a judge. I don't know what they all did, but they, as a group, generally did pretty well. So anyway, so my dad discovered that a brother and a sister had survived. One brother was killed, but another 2 survived. So It's a really sweet story. My dad and his sister had, well, my uncle was quite a bit older than my dad, so he moved to Paris before the war. And my dad and his sister addressed the envelopes when they were young, when they were kids, to their brother. So after the war, someone came with a postcard and said, write to anyone you think might have survived the Holocaust. So my dad wrote to his brother, and the sister survived totally separately. None of the three knew that they'd survived. She wrote to the brother, and that's how they reunited. So my uncle lived in Paris, and he came up to see my dad. I think that's in Windermere. You'll see in the movie a reunion of two brothers, and so I can only imagine how amazing it was. My dad did write about how it was so special to see his brother, who he hadn't seen for many years. And then actually, just to give you another example of how this committee cared for the children, a couple of years later, my dad got healthier and went to Paris. He was going to go to Paris to visit his brother. So the committee didn't want to just let him go, even though he would have been probably 20, 21 by then. They contacted the brother and they said, do you have enough money for food for your brother for 2 weeks, the 2-week visit? Do you have enough money for coal for him, to keep the place? Because they were worried about his health. His health was very fragile. And they were sure that he could support his brother, but they didn't just let him go. So this is the kind of love and care that my dad received as one of these children. It was pretty amazing. They also, I should mention, when they found out my aunt had survived, they tried to bring her in as one of the children. But then they discovered she was engaged and she soon got married, and so they were not allowed to bring in a young married couple, but they did try. So they went the extra mile. They tried to make these children rebuild their lives. So this is in 1948, before Israel was Israel, it was still Palestine. The three siblings met. As far as I know, it's the first time they got together. I'm not 100% sure. My dad's under the yellow arrow, his sister under the pink, and his brother under the blue. And the other man is my aunt's husband. So they were together in Marseille, France. As far as I know, that's the first time they were together. But we knew them growing up. They used to come every summer to visit, and so I knew them, and I know my cousins, and so they were not strangers to us. Even though they lived, my aunt went to Palestine and then Canada. My uncle lived in Paris, and his children live in France still, and we lived in England and then in the U.S. So it was far geographically, and we didn't have Facebook, and long distance calls were tough, but they managed to really have a close relationship. I think just knowing that they had each other was so important to them.
What language did they speak after the war together?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
After the war, what language would they speak together?
They spoke English. My aunt lived in Israel for many years, so it took her a while to learn English. But then she did, because she lived in Canada. My French cousins, one of them spoke English and one didn't until she was an adult. So now, when I see her, we speak in English.
The siblings, they didn't speak Yiddish together?
They didn't. I don't think they really did. I should ask Mom. Did Dad and his siblings speak Yiddish when they were together? Do you remember?
I don't think they did. They maybe quite a few expressions. What do I say?
They used quite a few Yiddish expressions, my mom
Yeah,
said.
this is the mishkit, this is zaygit.
This is nicht good, it's not good, it's very good, it's very good. Yeah.
It's so interesting because my parents told me the Jewish community in Poland, we spoke Yiddish in the home and Polish outside,
Oh, so that is what they spoke when they were young. They spoke Yiddish and Polish, those were their mother tongues.
Yeah.
Now my aunt, who survived the war as pretending to be not Jewish, she suppressed her knowledge of Yiddish because she was afraid she might, in her dreams, call out. So the story when after the war, she was walking down the road with a cross on her, and she came up to a group of Jewish men, and she said, "Are you Jewish?" And they said, "Yeah." She said, "I thought none of the Jews survived And they said, yeah, well, we're Jewish. And she said, so am I. And they're looking at her like, you got a cross on and you're speaking Polish. So one of them took out a siddur and she could read it. And one of them was my uncle, who she married. And so this young, Jewish woman who looked like a Polish woman, the group of Jewish men, they said, come with us, like, you need to be with Jews. So she did suppress her Yiddish because of that. So I don't know the answer for sure, but I don't remember, and my mom doesn't seem to remember them speaking Yiddish after the war too much.
Yeah.
But they might have. David, do you remember?
I thought they spoke Yiddish, I thought.
You did think they
Yeah.
did?
When we went to Toronto sometimes, and they were in a group of other people as well, like maybe Shmochaim, I thought they spoke Yiddish.
Yeah, so maybe when they were together without us.
When they didn't want you to understand what
Yeah,
they were
yeah,
saying.
No, when they were getting
definitely.
themselves.
Yeah.
Judy, who organized this whole Windermere? Were there Jews?
Oh,
Was
yeah,
it
well, yeah,
Democrats?
so there was a man you'll see in the movie. Well, it was called the Central, Central British Fund or something like that. No, Central British Committee, I think. Another name I've seen is the CCCC, the the Committee for the Care of the Children from the Concentration Camps. But basically now it's called the World Jewish Relief Agency.
So it was a Jewish organization?
Yes, so
That makes sense about the way they were caring for them.
right, so
It's
this
a whole
man,
other level.
yeah,
Just
it
food.
really was. So this man, Leonard Montefiore, who you'll see in the movie, he had the idea, before the war was over, like 1942 or 43, he started planning for what he hoped would be some surviving children. And he spoke to the British government. He said, I want to bring survivors over here. And he had to find places for them. I mean, you bring 732 kids over, you gotta have a place for them to live and food and like bringing in teachers and like getting them to get on their feet. It's a massive organization. So he was the brain power, the organizer, but then England let them in but didn't finance anything. So the Jews and the Quakers, interestingly enough, raised money for these kids, and so that's how that worked. They had a committee that worked on it, yeah, so that's basically how it worked. There is a documentary that goes along with this movie that if you're interested sometime I can show, and it talks more about how the whole organization was put together and who's who and what they did. Okay, so this picture is not in Windermere. This is a place called Quermead. And this was one of the sanatoria that my dad went to a couple years later to continue recuperating from tuberculosis. But the reason I put it in here is this is where he met my mom. And obviously they got married
The star of the show.
and had a very strong and beautiful marriage for over 70 years. My mom, I think, was really a strength for my dad to get through what he had to, recover from. But she was very much a part of the story when she came onto the scene.
So Judy, was it that her sister was the nurse?
Yes, my mother's sister was the nurse that was taking care of these kids with tuberculosis. So my mother went to visit her sister, and the rest is history. They met. That's how they met. So you saw my dad at the beginning of his education journey, lying in bed and starting to learn, and he did his whole correspondence course, which I don't even know how that worked, to learn whatever he had to learn. And I want to give you another example of what the committee did in England. They have these matriculation exams, and they're very serious and intense, and if you don't pass, you don't go on to the next level. So my dad, at a certain point, he had 2 or 3 years of education under his belt. He had to go to London for 3 days and take 3 days of intense testing. He was very nervous. So one of his teachers went with him to accompany him and keep him calm. And the head nurse, the one before my aunt, she arranged when the testing was all done for them all to go, my dad and the teacher and the nurse, to go to a concert. And my dad never forgot that kindness, to go celebrate with a beautiful Brahms concert, violin concerto, which he said he always loved all his life because it was so special. So anyway, my dad went on to get a master's degree and a PhD in physics, and we were always very proud of him, thinking about what he'd had to go through and all the challenges to make it, to be able to do that. And so with his education, he worked as a physicist in England for a few years, and then he went to the US to work on the movie camera that went to the moon on the Apollo mission. So when you see Neil Armstrong coming down the ladder, that's my dad's camera that he worked on. So, and then after that whole thing ended, he had an illustrious career for many years. He moved to California and worked for a lot of high-tech companies, and so he had a very good professional life. He also had a good spiritual life. You may recognize this picture from upstairs. This is my dad with Mark Furneaux. You can see my dad's number on his arm that he got in Auschwitz. I think Cliff Snapper captured that very powerfully. He also built an amazing family. This picture is from quite a while ago, but that's my dad, my mom. You may recognize the Rebbetzin, my brother and me. And the family continues to grow. So one of our great nieces made this beautiful star chart. There's a star for every descendant of my parents. So my parents had 3 children, 15 grandchildren, and we kind of lost track of the count, but I think it's about 50 great-grandchildren. And I'm sure that's not the end of the great-grandchildren. And my dad always said this was his ultimate revenge against Hitler. Hitler tried to kill him and all the Jews, and didn't manage to do that, because here we are, being fruitful and multiplying. So I always had the feeling that I wanted to thank all the people that helped my dad. I didn't know most of the story until quite a bit later, because my dad didn't really talk about it much. But Montefiore was older than my dad, and he died a long time ago. But last summer, when I went to the reunion of the boys, I was able to meet Montefiore's grandchildren. That's his grandson and his granddaughter. And I was able to thank them retroactively for all that their grandfather had done. And just a couple weeks ago, Oscar Friedman, who you'll see in the movie, he was a psychologist, but later he was like an administrator, did a lot. He taught my dad a lot of financial lessons and things like that. So his grandchild contacted me, and so we'll be in touch. And what else did I want to say
This
about that?
Montefiore is a descendant of Moses Montefiore, who donated the settlement, or built up the settlement
Right, in
outside
Israel.
Yerushalayim. I mean, of the old city.
Yeah,
It's the
I'm
same
imagining
name.
they're related. I don't know for sure.
It's so unusual.
Yeah, I know that the Montefiore family was a very wealthy and what do you call it? Philanthropic. So I don't know that they're related, but I wouldn't be surprised if they are. Or did I want to say anything? Yeah. So when I think about my dad's trajectory, I feel like in some ways he saw the worst of what humans can do in Auschwitz, and he saw some of the best of what humans can do when the camera and the space, the astronauts in the spaceship went to the moon. So the tagline for the children is triumph over adversity, and I think what you see with my dad and so many of these children was that they had such horrible things, but with so much support and love and care, they were able to really do so much with their lives. So I'm grateful that my dad was one of the Windermere children. And without further ado, I'd like